كنتم خير أمة أخرجت للناس تأمرون بالمعروف وتنهون عن المنكر تؤمنون بالله وتأمرون بالمعروف وتنهون عن المنكر.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. اللهم صل على محمد.
So before we enter these alam shahadat of Amir al-Mu'mineen Ali Nabi Talib alayhi salatu wasalam, I don't like to mix the days of Ayyam Shahadat with anything else. Ali has his own time. Amir al-Mu'mineen gets his own special time, inshallah. But we had started a discussion concerning the history of Islam, the history and development of Islam in North America. And as you remember, we had said that this discussion is important for us to have because a lot of our people, a lot of our youth, and it's not really, maybe I gave the impression before that it's only immigrant youth that are struggling with this issue of identity. Am I an American or am I a Pakistani? Am I an American or am I a Iraqi? Am I an American or am I a Muslim? And trying to figure out where we fit into. This actually happens amongst the convert community too. And I wanted to just mention that to you real quick this evening, just to get a little smile on my face, especially because I'm feeling kind of slow at the end of the day of fasting, right? So it happens with the converts too. A lot of times when we accept Islam, then we reject everything about the culture that we belong to. And this is quite common. So when we became Muslim then, so we want to change our name and we want to change the way we dress. And I've seen brothers become Muslim and in just a matter of days, now they're wearing, I don't know, shalwar kameez or dish dash. It depends on what community they become Muslim in. They got a miswak in their mouth. If they come in with the wabiyun, they put a miswak in their mouth. And also you see these brothers get an accent. Like brothers that were born and raised in America, now they have an accent. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi, brother. Oh, brother, how are you doing, brother? No, come on, man. But it can happen to where when we accept Islam, we reject everything about that previous culture of ours. And we have that kind of, I don't know how to say it, inferiority complex also, And for our immigrant brothers, we have to be on our guard also when you come across converts to Islam, because they're naturally going to look up to you. They feel like because you're from Iraq, because you speak Arabic, because you're born Muslim, then automatically you're an example for them. We have to be aware of that part of it too, right? But addressing this issue of identity is so important. And what makes it so important is because our young people, our people should not have to choose between being an American or a Muslim. We have to find a balance in this identity. So that we don't have to say, well, I'm an American, so that means I'm not a Muslim. Or I'm a Muslim, and that means I have to reject everything about America and American culture, right? Which this isn't the case. And in the term of our discussion, we'll go over this, that there's good things about America and American culture. Like if you Google top 10 American values, you get an opportunity to do that. Google what are the top 10 American values. You're going to see that there's nothing there that's against Islam. So it's important that we have this discussion. And we started having this discussion from the time we arrived, from the time of the 14th and the 15th, inshallah, of Ramadan. We went over the fact that the fall of Muslim Spain was one of the factors that introduced Islam into the New World. After the fall of Muslim Spain, after the fall of Granada in 1492, then there was a type of a crusade against Muslims in Spain. They were deported, they were forced converted, and many of them who were forced converted or deported ended up in the New World, to the point where one of the earliest reports of masajid and Muslims existing in the New World is Cuba, the island of Cuba in the West Indies. Because Cuba was one of these main Spanish settlements in the New World in the 1500s. And so Muslims established themselves very early in Cuba and Jamaica, for the record, right? Now, what ended up happening at least with Spain, was Spain eventually forbade Muslims coming into the New World. And so that's why you see a lot of what they call conversos or moriscos entering the New World. But we kind of went over that already, as far as with the collapse of Muslim Spain and the voyages of Columbus and some of these Muslims that entered into the New World in the early 1500s and onward. And then we started our discussion concerning Africa. See, we're still in the foundational periods. Within this week, though, I promise you, we're going to work up to our contemporary age, so that you can get an understanding of movements like the Nation of Islam, Moorish Science Temple, the Five Percenters, the Islamic Party of North America, the Dawah Party of North America. These are all Islamic movements that were born and raised here in North America, and we'll go over those things, inshallah. But as far as our foundations were concerned, I think we started talking about Africa. And I think we made the point already that African Muslims had been exploring North America before Columbus. In fact, American Indian tribes in the Caribbean and in the Americas testify to Muslims coming from the South. And I told you the story about the Spanish explorers that were captured by American Indians, held captive for 3 days, and then on the 4th day, an American Indian was brought who spoke Arabic. And he was able to translate for the Arab explorers and to negotiate their freedom. I think we went over all of this. Next, we started talking about the period of slavery, if I'm not mistaken. And I mentioned to you that during the period of slavery, more than 30% of every slave brought to America was a Muslim. This is a huge number of Muslims that were imported to America. And this should serve as an example to us also. Those of us who are living in America now, we should be on our guard and learn from their example. And here's one point I want to bring up then. Since we're talking about it, we got a little bit of time tonight because Futur isn't till 9. Y'all got anything planned before Futur? Huh?
Yeah, 10 minutes before.
10 minutes before Futur? Okay, fair. What happened to all the Muslims that came to this country? 30 to 35, some scholars even say maybe 40% of all slaves brought into the New World were Muslim. What happened to them? Where'd they go? Any ideas? Shall I tell you what happened to them? Yani the same thing that could happen to us today. And this is why it's important to study this history and understand this history, because if we don't learn the history and understand the history, then we may be doomed to repeat it. What happened to those Muslims? Well, one thing that happened was, and this is very fundamental, and our sisters, I hope they're listening, is the foundation of the household is the woman. Yani if you want to keep Islam in your household, then you need a Muslim woman at home. And that's what it comes down to. Many of the Muslims that came into the New World in history, they married non-Muslim women. How much can you, as a man who has to go out and work and earn a living or do whatever, how much can you train those children? How much Islamic culture can you give to them? Look at yourselves now. Look within your families now. Who does that work now? Your wives. Really, and we have to give these women the credit for that. Because we as men do not have as large a cultural impact on our children as our women do, as their mothers do. And so one of the things that happened to early Muslims that entered the country, and especially those who were in bondage, was they didn't marry Muslim women. They didn't have Muslim women to help them raise their families, not to mention all the other strains that they faced. And since we're talking about this period of slavery, a slave is not his own. As we know, in the slavery that was practiced in the West, it was chattel slavery. And so the slave did not have his own self-determination. His wife and his children could be sold away from him at any time. Families could be divided at any time. And so for this reason, we see that even though 30 to 35%, which are very conservative numbers, of all the Muslims of all the slaves that came to the New World were Muslim, we see that very few of them survived history so that we know about them today. And very few of them were able to hold on to their religion or pass it on to the generations that came after them. Now, I gave you some examples of some slaves who came here, and I gave you one example of a slave who came here, and because of his knowledge, because of his culture, because of his Islam, then he was able to get free and return to Africa. Ayub ibn Sulaiman ibn Ibrahim Diallo, from what we know as today, present-day Senegal, right? This man came, he was very highly educated, he was a scholar in Islam. It's reported that he wrote 3 Qur'ans from his memory, and 3 copies of the Quran from his memory. We're talking about back in the 1700s in America, right? Through his connections, through his education, and through just good fortune, he was able to negotiate his own freedom and return to the Gambia, and even negotiated the freedom of his good friend Al-Amin Ndiaye, who was captured with him, shipped into slavery to the New World with him, and was able to, after a few years, negotiate his freedom also. And Al-Amin was also returned to Africa. But this is very rare in the history of Muslim slaves in the Americas, that they were able to gain their freedom and return to Africa. There are other examples. One I'll mention for you tomorrow night. They made a movie about this man, Prince Among Slaves. A genuine African prince, Abdurrahman Suri, who was captured in battle and shipped to the New World as a slave. However, he was also able to gain his freedom and return to Africa. But tonight, I'd like to talk to you about Uncle Moro, he was known as. Uncle Moro, whose original name is Omar ibn Sa'id. Omar ibn Sa'id was a Fula, from the Fula tribe. He was an Islamic scholar. He spent 25 years studying Islam in Africa, including Timbuktu. At that time, Timbuktu was a very famous center of Islamic knowledge in West Africa. And Omar ibn Sa'id was a prince and a warrior in the Futa Jalan region in Africa. He was captured in battle, and he was sent to the West. So let me read a little from his story. Send us salam. So Omar ibn Sa'id was a scholar born in what is today Senegal in West Africa. He was enslaved and transported to the United States in 1807. He spent the rest of his life enslaved in America. However, during his time in slavery in America, he reproduced from memory not just numerous copies of the Quran, because he was a scholar. He did spend 25 years studying Islam. Not only Quran from his memory, but they say 14 different manuscripts in Arabic, in fiqh, in aqidah, and his is the first autobiography of a slave written in Arabic in the Americas. So like I said, he was born in present-day Senegal in the Fouta Toro region, along the middle of the Senegal River in West Africa, to a very wealthy family. He was a Fula and an Islamic scholar who spent 25 years of his life studying with the most prominent ulama of West Africa at that time, learning subjects ranging from mathematics to ideology to jurisprudence. In 1807, he was captured during a military conflict, and he was enslaved and taken across the Atlantic Ocean to the United States. He was owned originally by a very cruel master in Charleston, South Carolina. But Omar ibn Said managed to escape from this master and flee north. And he arrived in Fayetteville, North Carolina. And there he was recaptured, sold back into slavery to a Mr. James Owen. Now then, James Owen was immediately impressed by Omar ibn Said because of his literacy in Arabic, because of the way he carried himself. And this is something that I think that we should understand as Muslims. In North America, slaves of a Muslim origin were preferred. This was not the case in Spanish colonies. In Spanish colonies, because of their history with Islam, the Spanish didn't want to import Muslim slaves. But because of the level of education, the level of sophistication, the level of civilization of Muslims from West Africa, so actually in the United States of America, in North America, Muslim slaves were preferred because of their knowledge of animal husbandry, and raising animals, because of their knowledge of agriculture, particularly in those areas of America where they grew rice and indigo. So because of this then, North American slave owners preferred Muslim slaves. And it wasn't until the middle of the 1800s that they started forcing slaves to accept Christianity. So before this time, it was very common to come across slaves who were Muslims who were actually in control of the master's plantation. And this happened quite often. In the case of Omar ibn Said, he also was one of these slaves, and it happened over and over again. If I get the chance, I'll mention to you about a brother named Yoro Ahmed. Yoro is a very famous Fulani name. Yoro Ahmed was a very well-known Muslim in the Maryland, Washington, D.C. In the Maryland area. Yoro was so well trusted by his master that they left him in charge of the whole plantation. And this was a job that was usually done by white men. You did not leave a slave to be the supervisor on the plantation. But it happened quite frequently amongst the Muslim slaves that they held such education, such knowledge, such culture and civilization that they were prized amongst the North American slaveholders. Now let's continue to the story of Omar ibn Said. Omar ibn Said lived into his mid-90s. He died at the age of 95 in the year 1864, and he's buried in Bladen County, North Carolina. He was also known as Uncle Moro and Prince Omar. Now, one thing that you're going to come across when you read any of these slave narratives is that many of the slaves accepted Christianity outwardly, because this provided some benefits for them, some opportunities for them. And so very often you would find slaves like Omar ibn Said accept Christianity outwardly. And it's recorded that on December 3rd, 1820, Prince Umar accepted Christianity outwardly on December 3rd, 1820. However, all of his documents that he wrote, the 14 manuscripts, the autobiography, the Qur'ans that he wrote from memory, as well as his own copy of an Arabic Bible, are held in various libraries today in North America. including the Library of Congress and numerous libraries in North Carolina. And when we look into his writings, then we see another side of Umar ibn Sa'id. Senna Salabat. So, one of the things that we can see in the notes that he wrote, the Hashiyah, in the Bible that he owned, are frequent notes about Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. There's numerous dedications to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam written in his Bible. And on a card that remains in the Library of North Carolina till this day, dated 1857, on which he wrote Surah An-Nasr. On the back of this card, in someone else's handwriting, probably his master's handwriting, it's written that this is the Lord's Prayer in Arabic, and they attest to Umar being a Christian, but this was not the Lord's Prayer. It was Surah An-Nasr that he had written down. Umar ibn Sa'id also identified himself as a Christian in his biography. But scholars have said that when you read this biography in Arabic, it's clear that you can see that Umar is addressing two audiences. One audience is the audience of the slave master and his family and friends, and that's one audience that he's addressing in his autobiography. The other audience is Muslims. And so, for instance, even though Umar ibn Sa'id outwardly accepted Islam outwardly accepted Christianity, we see that in his references, in his writings, he refers to Hazrat Isa as Al-Masih. And he calls him Sayyidina Isa Al-Masih, which is exactly what we call him. There's no difference between how Umar ibn Sa'id is referring to Hazrat Isa and how Umar ibn Sa'id is referring and how we refer to Hazrat Isa. His descriptions of Hazrat Isa contained in the Hashiyah, in the notes of his Bible, conform completely to Islamic beliefs about Prophet Jesus. Even in his Hashiyah, he's mentioned that the Trinity is not mentioned in the Bible. So we see that Umar ibn Sa'id, although he outwardly accepted Christianity, he held on to his Islam and expressed his Islam in his writings and in his recordings that he made during his life. Literally analysis of Said's autobiography suggests that he wrote this autobiography for two audiences. One, for his Muslim brothers and sisters, and the other audience was for the slave master and his family. And so you see in this autobiography, Umar ibn Sa'id says, please forgive me for what? For converting outwardly to Christianity. And he says, forgive me for not speaking in our original talk, when he writes to one of his African brothers, speaking about their mother language. I mean, not Arabic, but their original African Fula language, right? He writes in his autobiography, oh, my brothers, do not blame me. And this is a clear indication that he's trying to show his Muslim brothers who may read this autobiography at a later date, that don't blame him for what? For outwardly accepting Christianity. Manuscripts. Umar ibn Sa'id is widely known for 14 manuscripts that he wrote in Arabic, including a treatise on Quran, some tafsir of some of these short surahs of Quran, as well as the only Arabic autobiography of a slave to exist in North America, written in 1831. In his autobiography, he describes some of the events in his life and includes reflections on his steadfast adherence to Islam and his openness towards people, God-fearing people of other faiths. On the surface, the document may appear to be tolerant towards slavery. However, Omar ibn Said starts the document with Surah Al-Mulk. And you know, if you know about Surah Al-Mulk, one of the central themes of Surah Al-Mulk is that Allah is the master of human beings. And so Umar ibn Sa'id starts this autobiography of his with Surah Al-Mulk in a way railing against slavery and preaching against slavery using this chapter of Quran. This manuscript is the only known Arabic autobiography of the slave in America, and it was sold within a collection of Ibn Said's documents between private collectors prior to the Library of Congress getting it in 2017. So today you can go on the Library of Congress's website and see many of Umar ibn Sa'id's writings. It has since been treated and preserved to preserve it for the generations to come, and it's been made viewable online. Most of Ibn Sa'id's other work consists of Islamic manuscripts on jurisprudence and ideology written in Arabic, including a handwritten copy of tafsir on some of the short chapters of the Quran that are now part of the North Carolina collection in the Wilson Library at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. His Bible, a translation into Arabic published by the Missionary Society, which has many notes in Arabic written by Umar, is part of the rare books collection at Davidson College. Said was also the author of a letter addressed to his master's owner, and this gets very interesting. Remember a couple of nights ago we talked about sihr, right? Umar writes a letter to his master's brother, including Surah Al-Mulk. In the tradition of West African Muslims, y'all know anything about Islamic numerology? You know, before the Indian numbers were introduced to because of 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, as we know it today, these are actually Indian numerals. We call them Arabic numerals, but their source is in India. They were transferred to the West through the Arabs. Islamic numerology, and those of you who've studied Islam, then you know it, right? When we want to number something in a book, right? We put alif for 1, isn't it? Ba for 2, isn't it? Jim is what? Number 3, and so on and so forth. I have charts in my notes. I can share it some other time, inshallah. Islamic numerology is basically the numerical values of Arabic letters that were used before the introduction of Indian numbers. Just like the Romans, Arabs used letters to signify numbers before Indian numbers were introduced. This system of Arabic numerology is also been developed in West Africa into an occult science. And we also have it in Islam also. Like for instance, if I want to break into any coach's house, the code is usually 786. What's 786? That's the numerical value of Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. When you add up Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim in Islamic numerology, its value is 786. This is why 786 is used to represent Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. It's actually also in West Africa an occult science. Umar ibn Sa'id writes a letter to his master's brother, And in that letter includes certain verses and chapters of Quran with a great deal of geometric designs. And in those geometric designs is Islamic numerology. This points to the fact that Umar was trying to do something esoteric, something non-physical with his master's brother. Yani maybe try to convince him to free him, maybe try to cast some kind of spell on him, or influence him in some other way. And as Muslims, we shouldn't immediately condemn this type of behavior because we have this established in Islamic tradition also. Like for instance, just real quick because time is running out, but just so that you can understand where Umar ibn Sa'id's mind was and how well grounded this man was in the Islamic sciences, even though he was a slave in North America. You guys know Huruf al-Muqatta'a, right? Huruf al-Muqatta'a in Quran, like Alif Lam Mim, Ha Mim, these different symbols that are in the beginning of certain chapters of Quran, right? Okay, here's something you should know then. I can't remember it anymore because I rarely have any need for these things. But this is stated in Islamic tradition, in hadith and riwayat of Shia ulama also. If you run into a situation where you want to convince somebody, you're going to face your enemy, and you want to convince this enemy to do what we tell them to do. So you begin with huruf al-muqatta'a, with your thumb, from the beginning of Quran, and you recite these huruf al-muqatta'a as they appear in the Quran, one by one. There's 10 of them. There's 10 of them in the Quran. So you start, as an example, Alif, Lam, Mim, so on and so forth. Always with the thumb on each finger first. You hold this once you've recited the Huruf al-Muqatta'a and fold it in your fingers like this. When you meet your enemy, you open the hands. And it's mentioned in the ayat that this is supposed to make that enemy agree with you, do whatever it is that you need from them. So I'm not trying to like get into this deep discussion on this evening, but Umar ibn Sa'id writes a letter to his master's brother. And in this letter are geometric designs with Islamic numerology. And today we don't know what he meant by it, but definitely Umar ibn Sa'id was trying to do something to his master's brother. Okay? We have a deep history of Islam in North America. We as Muslims in North America should never feel that we are foreign to North America. We were here before Christianity. Our religion has had more influence on North America than Christianity. Today, the Christians in North America tell you that this is a Christian country, but this is not what Thomas Jefferson said. This is not what George Washington said. This is not what Benjamin Franklin said. Each and every one of them said that America is not a Christian country. And in fact, Thomas Jefferson felt that the American experience and the American experiment in democracy would only be successful when we had a Muslim as a president. And this is what Thomas Jefferson said way back who much when. So this country was never founded as a Christian country. It's as much mine and yours as it belongs to anyone else. And as the days roll by, we'll discuss this more, inshallah. Send us salawat. Ya Allah, have mercy on our souls, forgive us of our sins and guide us to your straight path. Ya Allah, set firm our feet in your path, strengthen our limbs in your service, hasten the appearance of your Imam, and make us his helpers and supporters upon his return. ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. صلوات Never mind this.
मसरूफ मदात मितना माँ पे ज़मीं आसमां में शर कसमा है 19वीं रमज़ान का ये राग बयां है तारीफ ये वो है जो कयास नहीं का है मोमिनो सर की तो करो मेरी माता है मोमिनो सर की तो करो मेरी माता फारिग जो तहज्जुद से हुए फाते खैबर और जहन में आए जो ही हुजरे से निकल कर बस हस्द किया है तब भी जाने कबार होता के अता फजर का वो फर्ज मुकर्रर मुर्गाबियों ने लिया के वली को दरवाजे पे जाने नहीं देती थी अली को दरवाजे पे जाने नहीं देती थी अली को गोया हुए मुर्गाबियों से है तेरे करता इस उन्स की दे तुमको जजा खालिक बाबा नाले न करो सब्र करो ऐ मेरी गमखा नाले न करो सब्र करो ऐ मेरी गमखा दामन को मेरे छोड़ दो यूं अश्क न बरसाओ मस्जिद में मुझे जाने दो दरवाजे से हट जाओ मस्जिद में मुझे जाने दो दरवाजे से हट जाओ पहुंचे जो ही मस्जिद में अली देखा ये मंजर औंधा पड़ा सोता है नहीं एक जमीन पर जब उसके करीब पहुंचे तो गोया हुए उठ पैर वे इब्लीस की और सितम कर मालूम है सब किस लिए तू आया है सुबह, किस काम के करने का यहाँ पर है इरादा, किस काम के करने का यहाँ पर है इरादा।